Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. As Canada prepares to observe the 4th Annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, we're checking in with Indigenous nonprofit leaders from across the country about what, if any, progress has been made when it comes to how the wider nonprofit sector supports, funds, and collaborates with Indigenous-led organizations. Are legislative changes to how charities can work with non-qualified donees making a difference? Are Canadian foundations doing a better job of ensuring more funding dollars go to Indigenous-led groups? To discuss these important issues, I'm joined by Janine Manning, Executive Team Lead of the Indigenous Peoples Fund. Janine Manning is Anishinaabe and a member of the Chippewa of the Nawash Unceded First Nation and identifies as urban Indigenous, having been born and grown up in Toronto. For over 13 years, Janine has been in the nonprofit and charitable sector in a range of leadership roles, supporting Indigenous-led nonprofits and charities, Indigenous-serving organizations, and programs advancing Indigenous relations and community prosperity. As a consultant, Janine supported organizations to build healthy programs, policies, and practices to achieve their equity and reconciliation commitments. As past chair of the Laidlaw Foundation, Janine was the first Indigenous person to chair a private family foundation in Canada. As such, she is outspoken about diverse governance leadership in the philanthropic sector and the inclusion of Indigenous people in building community abundance through decolonizing and redistributing wealth. Welcome to the podcast, Janine.
Thank you, Mary. I'm happy to be here.
I was hoping we could start off by introducing the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund to our audience. Can you share a little bit about the history of the fund, how it came to be, and the work that it's doing?
Sure. So we don't have a very long history. IPRF started in 2020 with the onset of the pandemic. Discussions were had about, Indigenous communities being left behind in the economic responses and outreach during that time. So these conversations began with seed funders on how to support Indigenous communities and how to engage the larger philanthropic sector to do just that. And so the initial investment from our peers was about $1.5 million. And it was really used for emergency response for Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast. And then in 2021, the conversation about having a legacy fund began, kind of akin to what Western philanthropy would call an endowment. And we wanted to do it in our own way, and the idea is to manage the fund, the capital, akin to how we would do stewardship in many traditional territories and family hunting grounds, guided by the principles of taking only what you need and using all of it, and leave enough for those to come behind. So with that, we continued our work as the pandemic kind of winded down. Not to say it isn't still with us and that people aren't still affected by it, both health-wise and economic-wise. But in 2022, IPRF received its charitable status, and then developed a vision, that we would work within the relations of all to live well. This really acknowledges that Indigenous communities are not homogenous. We don't take a pan-Indigenous approach. We recognize that from coast to coast to coast, every Indigenous community is unique. And our ambition is our ambition vision or statement, as you would call it, is grounded in the values of the people served. We honor the voices of Indigenous communities and organizations. So really trying to emphasize that we're led by community, informed by community to benefit community. And at that time in 2022, we developed our first strategic plan, directing IPRF to meet communities where they are at through a trust-based philanthropy approach. And so We embarked on a couple of journeys with different Indigenous consultants to kind of help us collect our thoughts, because we were moving very quickly. As quick as we were fundraising, we were putting the money out the door. We weren't sitting on it or building an endowment at that time. And the real question that we had for the consultants to kind of pose to the community members we were working with is, how can IPRF best serve all community efforts? And so this really led to the creation of one of our guiding documents called the Path Forward Report, to guide our future work through a series of recommendations embodying culture as a key focus of our investments. And I'll add that the Community Bundles program, which Western Philanthropy would consider like a granting program, has put out 65% of the funds have gone to food security. And to date, approximately 14 million to about 560 community-led efforts. And then come April of this year, I was actually hired as the executive team lead after 2023 was a period of transitional or leadership transition. So now we, as one of my recommendations is that to the advisory council, otherwise known as the board, was that we take time to pause and reflect so that we can adapt all that we've learned from our community partners in the past 4 years and through the consultation that we've done with community. So we're doing just that. Great time to do it in the summer as folks are unwinding and reconnecting with their communities, their family, the land. And so we really want to just appreciate as a team where we're at, and take a short and long view of where we're going, and be strategic and organized about how we will continue to show up for community and serve the community needs as directed by community. So yeah, I think the future holds that we will be enhancing our bundle program. We're looking at doing a long-term resilience fund. So it would be multi-year and increased amounts to the bundles. And yeah, we're really excited. We envision a very abundant future where, we take the view that money is medicine for restorative purposes. And I guess I'll say, I'll just wrap up, the kind of history of IPRF by saying that IPRF's work is rooted in the Philanthropic Declaration of Action, which was a response to the TRC. A group of folks in philanthropy came together when they did not see, charity or not-for-profit or philanthropy mentioned in the 94 calls to action, and they developed a framework to encourage and create brave spaces to encourage support of Indigenous charities, through that reconciliation lens.
Well, that's a lot to have accomplished in a very short period of time. Congratulations. That's such an extraordinary achievement. I'm so very glad to hear the progress that's been made. Over the past few years, especially since the pandemic, research has shown that a very small percentage of funding has gone historically or is going to Indigenous-led organizations. I'm wondering, what have you seen in this regard during your career in the nonprofit sector? I'm assuming that this is very much something that you witnessed as part of your work.
Mm-hmm. So I will say, my career spans beyond my time with IPRF. I actually got involved with IPRF in the early stages when it was first being developed as a volunteer in 2020, and I supported the development of the review committee and the application process, and I even volunteered for a year to review applications. And I think that IPRF itself is a bit of an anomaly because we have created kind of our own way of doing philanthropy. Well, not created, but we've insisted that our partners take this journey with us, led by us. And so with IPRF, support has increased, quite noticeably year over year. But that isn't the case for the larger philanthropic or charitable sector. And prior to coming to IPRF, I was a fundraiser with an Indigenous health center. And I will say that the trends, we watch the trends, we watch the reports come through, and it is unique. Indigenous organizations will see an increase in funding depending on the news and the environment. But it will spike and then it'll drop the following year, which is what we've seen happen about, a few years back when the first residential school graves were found on site, and there that year, funding went from 1% a year to charitable donations in Canada to 3%. The following year, it fell to 2, and then back to 1. So it's unfortunate that our communities have to make the news tragically to. For donors, and I'm talking individual donors, not philanthropic partnerships, to take notice of the need with Indigenous communities. I hope that that changes in the future and that folks, give from a lens of, being neighborly, kind, and through the lens of reconciliation. With as far as philanthropy, and I think that the more public facing and public driven philanthropic organizations are very keen to support Indigenous efforts and share that they are invested in reconciliation and relationship building with Indigenous organizations. But as we know, the majority of philanthropic organizations are not very public facing or run by public folks on the board. So I will say it depends on the philanthropic organization, whether they've looked into their internally and prioritize Indigenous well-being and reconciliation through their investments in granting programs. So I hope that answers your question. It really, there's different factors to determine.
Absolutely. Well, it was a very nuanced answer, and of course, that reflects the reality of it. I guess certainly from what you're seeing in IPRF would be different than necessarily what other organizations are seeing across the country, depending on their particular location and the impact work that they're doing. I'm curious whether, in a broader sense, that you feel progress is being made. It sounds like, from your lens, you are seeing some. And I'm curious whether you've noticed that the recent legislative changes, for example, around working with non-qualified donees have made an impact as far as being able to have charitable organizations have an easier time of working with frontline community-based organizations that previously they may not have been able to because they weren't charities themselves or weren't considered qualified donees.
Mm-hmm.
Has the legislation kicked in to have an impact yet in improving things?
Well, in theory, I think all of us working in the sector and those who turn to the sector for support would hope that this be the case. It may be a little premature to decide whether it is. I do know that many philanthropists are still a bit intimidated, I think, to amending their programs to allow for non-qualified donees. And then there are other philanthropic organizations like Laidlaw Foundation, for example, who works with youth, who have been working with non-qualified donees through a trusteeship model for years, and they do it very well. So with IPRF, as we moved from emergency, urgency, relief, we have mostly always worked with non-qualified donees because that's where community effort is. That's who knows the community best, and that's who can mobilize the money and get the resources to the people who need it the most. But as we moved into our recovery and rebuilding and engaged with those consultants, we approached 700 different applicants. And, anecdotally, we learned that without IPRF, most of the efforts would have not otherwise been supported because they were non-qualified donees. And beyond the non-qualified donee status is the barriers that many philanthropic organizations and public granting many barriers they put up with their application and reporting process. It's very intimidating, for groups of volunteers, which is often what non-qualified donees, they just don't have the time, capacity, or experience to do such things. So one of the things we were asked for or encouraged to do by our communities was to kind of facilitate learning on how to navigate these spaces. I mean, in an ideal world, these systems that we've created in the philanthropic sector would meet community where communities at as non-qualified donees. But until we get there, I think that there's a learning curve. So yeah, I'll let say IPRF understands the needs to support charitable activity and satisfy the CRA requirements regarding qualified and non-qualified donees, but it's a bit premature. I think at this point, folks are still just really getting comfortable with the idea. So I think we'll have to wait and see a little bit more to see what the actual impact is from those legislative changes.
Well, that's fair comment. I mean, we are talking about very new legislation, so that's a very fair comment from your perspective. And but I have heard from legal experts even who say that the new guidelines dealing with the whole sort of administration related to non-qualified donees has been quite intimidating and really quite onerous. So that's a very interesting comment you also made about how the communities have been responding to it. Now, from the perspective of the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, it sounds like you've had significant success in both working with, non-qualified donees as well as qualified donees, and you've also seen. It sounds like you've seen support coming from a wider Canadian nonprofit sector, and that's really what I guess the goal was. Could you give us a bit more of a insight into that?
For sure. The seed funders were really rooted in philanthropy. And we find that our landscape of partnerships has grown beyond the philanthropic space. I mean, it's still philanthropy, but grown beyond like private family or private public philanthropic organizations. And we are now seeing support coming in from corporate charitable giving and also unions and individuals. Admittedly, IPRF, that's one of my tasks is we're going to be growing our individual giving program in the near future. But we've found that without solicitation, folks are coming to us as individuals a little bit more. So I can say with confidence, at least for IPRF, that we've seen wider support from the Canadian landscape and not-for-profit sector. And I think it's really because we stay true to our roots. We're really grounded in the Declaration of Action and Reconciliation, and I think that we're pretty keen on educating people about what that means as a philanthropic partner. And we want to be in reciprocal relationships to kind of offset that power imbalance that comes with transactional philanthropic relationships. So I do have some notes. I'm not sure if I feel like I had something more to add to that, but if I remember, I'll come back to it.
Well, you'll have plenty of opportunity because I wanted to also ask you about the McConnell Foundation. Apparently, has made a $10 million capital transfer to the fund. What did this mean to your organization, and was the fact that it was a capital transfer important?
Yeah, actually, that's exactly what I was going to say about the capital asset transfer. that was a huge leap of faith, or leap into trust-based philanthropy, to have our philanthropic partners trust that we as Indigenous folks working in the philanthropic space were, in tune with communities, and that they had trusted us to kind of steward this support on their behalf. And that's the early stages of IPRF was historical transfer of assets from In Spirit Foundation and Laidlaw Foundation. I was not yet chair. Um, and others followed suit. And then with the McConnell Foundation, it's a huge capital transfer. Um, and it's going to enable us to do is create that long-term bundle program. So we have historically dispersed through our bundle program $5,000 to $30,000 per project. And now we'll be able to increase that funding upwards to 100,000 a year for multiple years for those projects that really have the ability to have long-term impact and sustainability in their community, and really need more than a one-time bundle of $5,000 to $30,000. So we're really excited about that, and that's something we're looking at, in our time of pausing and reflecting, so that we can adapt and move forward in new ways to show up in new ways for our communities. And so we're really grateful for McConnell's support there. It's a multi-year support, so that means our long-term bundle program will also be multi-year. So for us, it's a very historical time, and that it represents growth, I think, for us as an organization, and for the the community members that are going to benefit from it.
Yeah, that's, I'm sure, makes a big difference when you can see your goals going forward into the future, and the capacity to be able to fulfill them. What advice would you give to other foundations who want to increase their funding to Indigenous-led organizations or foundations?
I guess that, IPRF itself, we have, we engage in this work because of historically being, having our communities and our community organizations being chronically underfunded by the philanthropic community. So we ourselves are leading a trust-based philanthropy model, based on actioning relations and to transform the sector, to transform power and capital to Indigenous communities. And we encourage folks to do the same. And so I'm not sure if you're aware, but there were a few of our peers who put out a report a few years ago, that Indigenous peoples, being only 4.9% of the Canadian population, but only receive just under 0.5% of gifted funds. So 1/10 of the funding they would receive because of population size, even if one ignores the issue of need, which is compounded. So we would get $1 for every $178 given to non-Indigenous groups or charities. And so we encourage folks in the work that we do, not just to support our work as an organization, but to support all Indigenous organizations and groups if they can. And, I don't, there's the only thing that's stopping philanthropic organizations is themselves. I know that I've met with many folks in the sector who are afraid of getting it wrong. And I always tell people that there's no error so wrong that you can't undo it. There's no relationship, I don't think, that you can't, repair. But just to, do this with intention, the best intention, with community at the center, and, just commit to actively learning year over year. And let the communities lead, let them tell you what they need, and ask them how it is they want to be in reciprocal relationships, so that you can kind of disrupt that power imbalance and make it less transactional. And that's kind of the foundation of what we do, is relationships and doing them well. Um, yeah,
Well,
that's what I'd say.
that's fantastic advice. And I was aware of those staggeringly horrible numbers in terms of the injustice of where this money was going to, and the lack of funding that was going to Indigenous-led organizations or Indigenous causes. Now, I understand that you have some very lofty goals for your fund, that the fund has a specific goal to raise $50 million by next year and $250 million within the next 4 years. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. IPRF has developed a capitalization strategy that has so far 15 million in capital commitments, and we will raise 50 million in 2 years. And hopefully, fingers crossed, and I have the utmost confidence in my team, we will raise 250 million in 5 years. So hopefully, after 5 years, the fund becomes self-sustaining, just through the interest generated alone, and will be less dependent on partnerships. And we can focus more on community and developing the programs that they need, the bundle programs that they need. And again, I'd mentioned some teachings and philosophies that we work under. So the long-term fund, as we call it, which would be traditionally known as an endowment fund in Western philanthropy, is really based on the principle of looking 7 generations ahead. We know historically it is taking many years for Indigenous communities to be in the positions they are because of colonial interference in our lives, and it's going to take many generations to undo that harm and to return to healthy and sustainable communities. So IPRF wants to be around and support the journey for communities. I was at a guest lecturer for Carleton University a couple weeks ago, and one of the students had asked my opinion on spending down, or when IPRF would spend down. And my opinion is that I think that's definitely the way to go for a lot of these historical older philanthropic organizations who maybe are not so in touch with current needs and trends in philanthropy, and especially those who are less public facing and publicly accountable by holding public seats or offering seats to the public. And an organization that does it really well is Laidlaw Foundation. We have 12 seats. The majority will go to public members or non-family members. And so if folks aren't in philanthropy, not spending down, they really need to, I think, bring the public community members into the fold so they can support their granting program and their visions of investing, so that they put money where money is needed. So my response to the student was that IPRF is just getting started. Spending down isn't a part of our conversations. And I don't think it should be for foundations or organizations like IPRF or the Foundation for Black Communities, for example. Black and brown communities have been so historically affected negatively by colonial systems, that we need to be empowered to support our communities. So we have a really long view. And I think it's important to mention that IPRF represents a new way of thinking and doing in the sector regarding our approach to building and sharing capital. So we have always given out well past the disbursement quota. This year alone, even though we have paused to reflect halfway through the year, we have dispersed 10%. And so in previous years, it's had been like 40%. So our strategy is also important. We want to improve how money is viewed. So we want to apply that money as medicine model and bring our partners on a restorative journey through their partnership with us. And as we work in investing in communities and culture. And so if folks want to partner with us and come along this journey, we welcome you. We welcome individuals also to support us monthly or one-time giving as they can, really through this lens of reconciliation. How have you benefited from colonization, and how have we as Indigenous folks lost? And so we're really taking this restorative view. and trying to break down, the transactional um, relationships that have historically been a part of philanthropy.
Well, you kind of almost had prescient idea of where I wanted to go with my next question, which was, this is such an important goal, and the long-term benefits that you can bring are enormous. How can other funders get involved with the fund? Have you worked that out yet? I know you're early in this sort of planning of this particular long-term funding. If they hear this interview, how can they get involved?
Yeah, they can reach out. I will say that I think folks are so interested in the model that we're developing and working on and working with communities that folks have really been responsive and just reached out to say, I want to be involved and how can we support? And um, we haven't really taken the aggressive reaching out method, which is great because that means folks are really interested in what we're doing and they want to be a part of our journey. So yeah, just reach out. We're really built upon resilience, and so we want to have resilient partnerships also. And if it's about reconciliation, I would encourage philanthropic organizations to really look at that philanthropic community declaration of action to see and bring that into their strategic plan, to kind of guide their way down that strategic reconciliation path, if you will, just to help them build braver spaces to be a part of, building up Indigenous resilience through philanthropy. Yeah, so really, it's just, the it's really just don't be shy, reach out. That's kind of how we like to do things, really.
Well, what are your thoughts on how the nonprofit sector can help to advance the reconciliation work that you're involved in?
hmm So next year in 2025 will be the 10-year anniversary of the TRC final reports, since they've been released, and including the 94 calls to action and the subsequent declaration of action for philanthropy community that was developed at that same time. So I would really encourage folks to now, mid 2024, look internally to see what have we done as a sector, as members of the sector, to support reconciliation, our Indigenous peers and communities, and what is it that we can do. You know, I hope that 2025, with this, historical 10-year anniversary, that we'll see another one of those spikes in charitable giving and philanthropic giving to Indigenous organizations. And I really hope that that spike stays up there and that doesn't drop down to, a percentage point every single year like we have seen with other historical events. So I encourage folks to really use the tools that are out there. There are many tools that have been developed by Indigenous folks in philanthropy and the sector to help folks, be in good relations with Indigenous organizations, communities, people. And as a former consultant, I can say there are many Indigenous consultants out there who are available to guide your journey if it's something you feel you need guidance on.
Well, can you share your perspective on how decolonization and redistribute redistribution of wealth may be part of this work? Excuse me. I actually, in the introduction, when I introduced you, we mentioned that you're quite passionate about that, and this has been part of the sort of soul of the work that you've been doing, both in the years before in the nonprofit sector and in your consulting work, even before you were with the fund. Can you kind of talk us through that so we understand it a little better?
Sure. You want me to talk from like my experience, or like how, in general, how I think philanthropy could do better in decolonizing their spaces and the sector in general?
Yeah, yeah. Your perspective is really what I'd like to hear from.
Sure. So I'll walk you down a little journey. So I, in 2017, started working for Ontario Arts Council, and I managed a historical fund of $5 million, and it was meant to support Indigenous organizations and community efforts to revitalize language, culture, um, you know, anything from land access or land-based teachings to youth and elders collaborations. It was for individuals and collectives. Some folks went home for the first time since leaving for residential school. Others were, creating language tools or learning to hunt and fish. And really, that was a pivotal moment for me, I think, in my charitable not-for-profit career, because it kind of got me into granting, which then led me into philanthropic sector. I was really looking for opportunities to become a better grant maker with, who serves Indigenous folks. And that's when I stumbled upon Laidlaw. And, I was accepted as a board member. Unfortunately, within a month, I think, of our current premier coming into power, he killed the program and I had to lay off the entire team. But I was still determined that through my experience, that this was a space that Indigenous folk needed to be in, because I started volunteering for Laidlaw, Ontario Trillium Foundation, and a handful of other non-Indigenous granting spaces. And I was the only Indigenous person. And, where I went to these spaces to learn to be a better grant maker, but what I found was that I was often teaching
Hmm.
folks who, in those spaces, how to understand applications from um, Indigenous communities, the different language we use, concepts, the importance of some activities. When it's in a pile, I'd see amazing applications from Indigenous groups, and people would dismiss it because they didn't understand it. And it's really hard to compare Indigenous applications to mainstream applications that are coming from urban centers or whatnot. So yeah, I found that, like, these spaces of power, really, reviewing applications or being on the board, they really need to be inclusive of, the community members you're serving. So if you're welcoming applications from Black and Indigenous folks, you need to have those people in those spaces in the governance level, as employees, um, to give you that perspective, that lens, to help you on your journey with those communities, to be in better relationship with those communities. And I did that work in various spaces for so long, and I'm still doing it. Um, it's hard work, and there needs to be more people in those spaces. And I was really fortunate that it was Laidlaw that brought me in, into the philanthropic space, because they have done their work. They know how to welcome people as their authentic selves. As a single mom, I needed childcare. They helped me with that. My hours were different because I had to compete with daycare hours. They flexed their hours for me, and they really helped me grow as a professional. And we know in the sector that you're not allowed to pay or remunerate board members, but they offered professional development budget line, and really helped me to develop myself as a professional. And I don't think I'd be here today if it was not for that volunteering experience. And so when I say we need to decolonize philanthropy, it's not just about who we give grant to. It's about who we have in the governance, in on the team, and those views. And not only are they supporting the communities you're serving, but it's supporting individuals like myself, to get that experience in that sector. And I will say that one of the people that started on the board of Laidlaw with me was Rebecca Darwent, who went on to be a co-founder of Foundation for Black Communities. And that's what I mean by saying, we need to decolonize this space by making it accepting to folks, not just folks who are of color or Indigenous, but accepting them as full, authentic people. Because I would not have been able to show up for 6 years if it was not for Laidlaw saying, we're going to help you with childcare, we're going to flex our meetings so that it's accommodating for you. Um, you know, And if I wasn't sitting with other like-minded people, because I have volunteered in spaces where I'm the only Indigenous person or the only person who's non-white, despite the fact that I'm white passing or can be. And it's hard. It's really hard. So yeah, that's what I mean. It has to be like a 360 decolonization of space, and I use the word decolonizing very loosely, because I don't think that philanthropy, as it is governed by the CRA and other acts, can be fully decolonized. But there are methods and ways that we can be more community centric and welcome and opening.
I really, it was very interesting to hear and appreciate the challenge of actually trying to translate these grant applications that came from the communities, and really, what a job it must have been for you to actually make them seen in the appropriate way, and share the kind of cultural sort of changes that would influence the decisions that might happen within those decision making rooms about where the money was going to go. I mean, what a pivotal role that would have been that would impact so many people. And your kind of appreciation and description of what decolonizing means to you, I think, is extremely significant and really enlightening for those that may not be totally understand it. And I really appreciate your sharing that with our audience. I'd like to know, looking ahead in the next few years, I mean, do you feel optimistic that Indigenous-led organizations will be receiving higher percentages of funding and fundraising dollars? I mean, certainly your fund is doing so well, and you have such high hopes for it and strong ambitions. But what about the broader sector? Like, what can we do to ensure that, as you say, it's not just a blip because of a media story that highlights a tragedy in the Indigenous communities? Like, what can we do to be a better partner and ally to the Indigenous communities and organizations?
I have to say that there is a lot of stereotypes that Indigenous communities and organizations face. One of the biggest ones is that the government supports us. And while they do to some extent, we are always short, and we always come up short. And I think, especially with individual donating, folks, they say, oh, well, I just heard in the news that 22 million was put aside for Indigenous healthcare. While that may be the case, how that trickles down to, communities, over 500 communities and just as many Indigenous organizations, it doesn't, right? I think it's really up to folks to educate themselves about how to show up. And, I think it's also the organizations themselves. Like I found that when I was fundraising, that individual donors really wanted kind of a community, not just a transactional, right? So I built up a monthly program in that Indigenous Health Center I was fundraising for, from like 100 monthly donors to 300 in a matter of, like, I think 18 months, because I didn't want to just take money. I wanted to also meet my donors and learn from them. And so how do you do that when there's 300 of them and one of you? So I developed a book club. So we'd all read the book together and we'd come together. And so I think folks really want to learn and they want to be a part of community. They don't know how to do that. So I would encourage Indigenous charities themselves to really think of, how are you exercising reciprocal relationships? Like, how are you being in good relations with those who do support you or want to support you? Not to say the onus is on Indigenous communities and organizations, but yeah, I think more opportunities like this, like the one you've given me today, to allow folks to learn and to learn and unlearn about Indigenous folks and philanthropy and charity, is really helpful. helpful. And I would encourage your peers to keep reaching out to Indigenous organizations and giving them these types of platforms to talk about their work and to talk about the impact in their communities through their work or through the donations and funding partnerships that they hold with Indigenous organizations and communities.
Well, Janine, you are welcome at any time on my platform, such as it is, to speak to the nonprofit sector. We are so grateful for your very wise counsel and your hard work over the years and the keen advice that you have to nonprofits and charities in Canada and foundations as they navigate their reconciliation journeys and seek better ways to support Indigenous-led organizations and communities and be partners with them. Thank you for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Oh, miigwech, Mary, it was a pleasure.